Okay, what I'd like to begin with is some of the reading that we did with YouVersion. I don't know if all of you had an opportunity to read some of that, but I thought it was interesting. And there's some things I have a little different view with him about. You may too, I don't know. And actually, to me, it's a positive thing to read something that doesn't necessarily agree with your thinking, so to kind of help you think through it. And and he says, others may disagree, and that's fine. And so here's some things I want to point out, and we can discuss this as you'd like to. If you haven't watched any of the YouVersion, it's okay. I think you'll catch on to part of what I'm saying. He said, we'll see an overview of the church age and what Jesus thinks of the church, good and bad. Okay, that's part of what he says. Now, how does he know this? How does he know that that's what we're going to see in the book of Revelation, an overview of the church age? He doesn't explain how he knows that. And so I'm not so sure that I'm buying into it. I'm open. I'm open to it. But I'm just not so sure about it.
So that's not a common, I've never heard of that before until I read his thing, but I don't know a lot. But is that not a common, that's not, a lot of people don't hold to that? The things I don't understand about Revelation have never really been about those first, the letters to the seven churches.
Yeah.
But him explaining that was periods of time and all like that, is that something that a lot of people believe?
Well, pardon?
I've heard it taught that way before too.
Yeah, it's a question about do a lot of people believe it? There's some people who do. It's been more popular at times in church history, and I plan to talk about interpretations of the book later on. But one of the problems, I would just go ahead and let you know, that I think with this type of view is I don't see much evidence. In other words, when we're talking about what is this scripture saying, I'd like to see some evidence instead of just, well, it seems to apply to this period of time. And that's part of my difficulties with buying into this idea that the different churches are different periods of church history. Here's what I know for sure. There were 7 different churches. If you look at a map, they're kind of in a circular. Each one, you could go to, it's a circular letter. You could take the letter to each one and probably make a copy. These were actual churches. That's what I know for sure. Now, are there principles within the writings that apply to different periods of time, different churches, and so forth? Yeah, that's true of all of Scripture. That there's principles within the Scripture that are helpful for us today. But to say, okay, this church represents this period of church history, this church represents this period, he doesn't give any evidence for it. And again, I'm open. Show me why I should believe that. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I just thought the last, what is he to, 4 and everything? The 4th church?
I think so, yeah.
I don't know, his thing about the 4th church and the 3rd or 2nd, it just didn't seem that far off. It's, well, I don't know how much I'm trying to say this. I don't know. When I got to those two and he was explaining that about the different periods, I thought, that seems too much alike to just be, for you to be saying it was to a different period. To a different period. I'm not explaining that well, but it didn't.
It's clear cut.
Yeah, the sexual immorality, I think was in the 2 of them, and I'm just like, well, how did that?
It didn't seem to fit the time series, is that what you're saying?
Well, it seemed like he was making it fit this time period, but it was almost saying something that could have fit the time period before when the reason he said it before for this time period, some of those same, things were said in this one, and it's like, so how how come this is in a different time period and not that time period? I don't know, it was just, I don't know, but like I said, I don't know a lot about it, so I didn't know if that had a lot of evidence somewhere, but I had never heard that.
Yeah, this is, and also I've heard, and some of you may know more about this than I do, and I wouldn't be surprised. But part of what I've heard is that, okay, so what's the seventh church? And I think for some in the Reformation, the seventh church was, the Roman Catholic Church was considered like the whore of Babylon. And you may think, well, that's pretty rough. Well, keep in mind that the Roman Catholic Church and the states, the nations that were associated with it, were persecuting the reformers, and they were killing the reformers. I mean, there was warfare taking place between the reformers and the Protestants and the Catholics, and I mean, we don't really have a lot of time going to church history, but it's like, yeah, that sounds like, well, that really doesn't, I mean, I don't know of anyone who holds today. There probably is, but I don't know of anyone today who holds that the Roman Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon. I don't, so that's part of the problem is through church history, when they've tried this type of approach to say the different churches or different periods of history, when it doesn't work out exactly right, then they have to adjust it, as time goes by. You see what I'm saying? So, but actually, again, I'm glad that we're reading this because I think it's kind of an introduction into the way some people have looked at it. And here's something else he said. And for you who want to see Christianity get more political power, learn a lesson from church history. Power corrupts. And enforcing Christian values on non-Christians often backfires. Power corrupts? Well, in that case then, Christians should never run for office because it's going to corrupt them. If they get into office and they have power, that's going to corrupt them. Power doesn't always corrupt. Now, if you want to talk about that with me, I'm willing to listen. But if that's true, that power always corrupts, none of us should desire any power at all, any authority. We just need to be timid and just do whatever people tell us. That's not what I see the scripture teaching. You may say I'm misunderstanding him. Well, I just quoted from him.
What was his reference to? I mean, when have Christian values been, what was he talking about?
I think he was.
Showing people, yeah. When does that happen that he's making a reference to?
I think he's talking about the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. I think that's what he's talking about.
What was the Crusades and stuff? When I was reading part of that, and I thought that, and I kind of thought, I'm not in a negative thing, but I just kind of thought, what I viewed it or took it as, when we have political people that say that they are Christian, and now we're so, as Christian people, or the church, say, oh good, we've got political leaders that are Christian, then we look to them rather than looking to God. That's how I took it. That may not be at all what he was saying, but that's kind of how I referenced it. It's just, because I think even, and maybe I was just referencing it to our latest, our, political issues that so many, in the church, and I mean, I would wanted to see the Republican Party still hold, to have the Senate, would like them to have the presidency because of the things, and then we don't rely and trust God for, God's in control. I mean, we can say that, but we were like, oh, but they've got to be in control. Oh my goodness, we're all going to fall apart now because this is taking place. Instead of saying, but God has a plan and God's going to fulfill that plan, I think a lot of times we have a tendency to look toward people to do that, and God puts people in place, but that's how when I was reading that, in my mind's eye, I just thought, it's kind of like U.S. today. We were just, so many churches and so many rallies and different types of things by church leaders were going after full-heartedly supporting a political agenda or political party, I guess you'd say. And then when they didn't do it, I think it was, it was just like all on them. They were going to be our redemption of the country. They were going to be the ones that keep America great. But that's how I took it. So apparently that wasn't what he was saying, but when I was reading it, that's where my mind went.
Well, and I can understand what you're saying, and I think that can be an issue for us, that we start to trust politicians when we need to turn our eyes to the Lord. On the other hand, I want to see more Christians in office. I want to see more Christians with political power.
Well, I do too, but I think sometimes, I think, is our focus on that God will place them there? Because he says he puts people in power, and he allowed evil people to have, even over Israel, Syria, he allowed it, and he said it was for your good. That's my paraphrasing of it, but that's pretty much what he did, because
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said, but he said, enforcing Christian values on non-Christians often backfires. Well, maybe it does, but I'm opposed to the sexual molestation of children. And I want to see the laws against that remain. And that may offend some non-Christians that we have laws that prevent them from molesting children. I'm sorry. So it would have helped. I'm not saying he doesn't have a point here in some ways. If you're going to force everyone to be baptized, which is what happened at one time in various nations, people were forced to be baptized when they were born. And if you didn't allow your child to be baptized, you could be in big trouble in some of these nations. I don't have a problem with that point if that's what he's talking about. So again, it's not like I'm trying to get in an argument with him. It's just some of this is not as clearly stated as I think it probably should have been, or maybe I just see things a little differently than he does. And again, I hope we keep reading the U version, because I think it's good for us to think through some of these things. Someone else have a comment or question about this before we move on to the book of Revelation? Okay. And if you disagree, I'm willing to listen to you. Like I've said before, you have every right to be wrong. So anyway, just trying to lighten things up a little bit. Sometimes I'm the one that's wrong. So, okay. So, A.T. Robertson was a great Greek scholar of the past century. I just thought I'd start tonight, after that little discussion, with something he said. Perhaps no single book in the New Testament presents so many and so formidable problems as the book of Revelation. These difficulties concern the authorship of the book, the date, the apocalyptic method, the relation to the other books that are supposed to be written by John, the purpose of the book, the historical environment, the reception of the book in the New Testament canon, and the use and misuse of the book through the ages. He's right. If this was a seminary class time, we could spend half of the course on all these problems that the book of Revelation has faced. To me, it's more profitable. Yeah, we need to look at the problems to some extent, but I'd rather focus on the promises that are in the book and the truth that we can find in the book. Yeah, there's a lot of things I don't fully understand and I have questions about, and we'll talk about some of those things, but also I want to focus on the promises. In other words, the enduring value of the book for us. So One of the problems, I'll just go ahead and mention this. I don't know if you're aware of this. We talked about it some, I think, previously, that this humanist Catholic named Erasmus was, at the time he began making a Greek New Testament, the Bible that was used by the Catholics was called the Vulgate. It was the Latin translation. And really, the church didn't want you to read it. They would tell you what it meant. It was thought that the church had the authority to interpret it for you. And, but Erasmus thought it would be good to have try to assemble the Greek New Testament and not just use the Vulgate. So, and Vulgate is the Latin translation, okay? So when it came to the book of Revelation, he only had one Greek text of the book of Revelation. And it was dated to around AD 1200 or so, the 12th century. So he had one Greek manuscript of the book of Revelation, and it was dated 1,200 years or 1,100 years after it was written. There was another problem. The last 6 verses of that manuscript were missing. In other words, the last 6 verses in the Greek were missing. So, what should he do? Well, I'll tell you what he did. He thought to himself, okay, the Latin translation here is such and such, so the Greek word must have been such and such. And he put in the Greek words that he thought were in the original based on the Latin translation. I'm glad to tell you that in spite of what I've just told you, it's pretty accurate what he came up with. I'm glad to tell you that. Now, having said that, I also need to tell you there's some words in the Greek text of his translation, of his Greek New Testament, that are only found in his Greek New Testament. They're not found in any Greek manuscripts anywhere. There's some of those words. We know those words were not part of the original text. They're not in any Greek manuscripts. Okay? The King James translation was based on Erasmus' Greek text. Okay? Again, I think the King James translation is the greatest translation in English that's ever been made. But when we talk about inerrancy, infallibility, I'm thinking of the original manuscripts. And we can trust the King James Version. I don't think it's going to lead somebody astray. But don't set it up as the translation to judge every other translation by. I'm sorry, if you want to talk about this some more, I'm willing to. But it's in the book of Revelation that we have a real issue here. Only one Greek manuscript he used, and it was written about 1,100 years after the book of Revelation was written. Okay. Any questions about that before we move on?
The verses that were missing was the last 6 chapters.
The last 6 verses.
Of chapter 22?
Yeah.
The very, very end.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying you can't trust the King James. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that don't take that as the infallible translation that we judge everything else by. Okay. Another question, comment?
What was the guy's name again?
Erasmus? Yeah. Erasmus. And I appreciate what he did, and he did the best he could with what he had, and I appreciate that. But Now we have a lot more text. We still have fewer text of the book of Revelation than the rest of the New Testament. And some of them are kind of late. But it doesn't cause me to have concern about the text. I think the text is very accurate. All right. Another question, comment about that? Okay. So, who wrote it? Who wrote the book? Well, from the first century to the present, most conservative evangelical Christians have considered that the Apostle John wrote it, but there's actually 4 different views about who wrote the book. And one of the most interesting views that's just come up in the past century is that John the Baptist actually wrote it. Yeah, that John the Baptist wrote it. I just think it's interesting that someone would propose that. I don't think there's any evidence for it. To me, it's just, anyway. Here's part of the reason. You'll see on the little handout I gave you, there's what's called internal evidence and external evidence, okay? So the internal evidence, that's the evidence within the book. External evidence is evidence outside the book. In other words, what does the book say in the book itself? What evidence is there within the book of who wrote it? And what evidence is there outside the book of who wrote it? And so the person who identifies himself in John chapter 1, verse 2, I believe. Does someone have their Bible open there? You can read verse 2. Or maybe it's chapter 1, verse 1. I think that's where it is.
Verse 1, it says, a revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John.
Yes, thank you. So that's who is identified as the author who had received this revelation is John. So part of my thinking is that if this was someone else besides John the Apostle, then this person named John would have identified himself. But the fact he didn't identify himself further suggests to me that this really was the Apostle John. But we don't know from just reading verse 1 whether it was the Apostle John or not. Okay? So that's where what's called the external evidence becomes important. What did the early church fathers say? So I think I have written some of this on the notes I gave you. AD 90, okay. It was claimed by Irenaeus in 180, AD 180, that the Apostle John wrote it in AD 95. Irenaeus, I believe, heard this from Polycarp, and Polycarp was actually knew the Apostle John personally. So to me, that's some pretty strong evidence. And then you also have Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Eusebius. One of the students of Origen, named Dionysius, I think is the way you say his name, thought that the Apostle John did not write it. And he thought someone else wrote it. And that was based upon something that was written by, I think his name was Papias. And other scholars have examined this writing by Papias, and it's possible that there's a line or two missing. And instead of the Apostle John being killed in around 65, AD 65 or so, there's a line missing in it. Maybe it says that James was killed, his brother. So Dionysius is much later. So in other words, the vast majority of early church fathers said this was written by John the Apostle. And so I have no reason to think John the Apostle did not write this. When you also consider the fact, if it was a different John, he probably would have identified himself differently.
Who were the other two? You said there were about 4 people that different people think.
Yeah, let me see if I can, there's a John the Elder that some say wrote a couple of couple of the Johannine letters, and that maybe this was written by John the Elder. And there's also a John that nobody knows anything about. I think he's the least likely. If maybe John the Baptist is least likely, I'm not sure. One of those two. But again, yeah.
Well, I was just wondering about the evidence of him saying I was on the island of Patmos. Did that not help with one of these? I mean, the evidence that it probably was John. Did they know that he went there?
Well, most of the early church historians would say that John did go there, and he spent the last part of his life there. Although there is some debate about whether he left there at some point, but again, it's this Dionysius that thought maybe John was martyred in the 60s, and so he's the one that he says someone else wrote this on the Isle of Patmos. So to me, I don't think there's any doubt but that John the Apostle wrote it. And that's the vast majority of conservative evangelical writers agree with that, but not all of them.
I'm going to agree that John wrote it. Just off of, you got bit by a poisonous snake, you didn't die.
Who is this?
John.
No, that was Paul.
Was Paul did that?
Yeah.
So then Paul got poisoned too, and didn't die.
No, John was never poisoned got bit by a snake and poisoned.
No, someone poisoned him. Did that. They was trying to kill John, right? Multiple people tried to kill John.
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Well, I could be wrong. I know I'm wrong, I guess. I thought they tried to kill John over and over and over again, and they said, "Look, man, we can't kill you. Send him over to this island."
That may be true. I haven't.
So that was my understanding.
That may be true. I haven't done extensive study on the Apostle John according to church history. That's a good question. You may be right.
So, what I was thinking was, you try to kill him, and he ain't dying. You send him over here to the island and say, "Hey, you can't tell nothing about God anywhere." You send him over there. So in my mind is, you're not dying. God's not done with you yet. What's the next thing? You're on the island sitting there with nothing to do. God sends you a dream, write this up for me.
Yeah, it makes me really curious now to go back and read what the church historians say about what happened to the Apostle John.
I've read somewhere, heard somewhere that he was they did try to kill him, and
Multiple times.
they tried to poison him and all,
And it didn't work.
and it didn't work.
Oh, cool. Good. Yeah. Well, like I say, I'm not surprised. There's a lot of church history I'm not aware of. So if you've done some reading in that area, I appreciate you sharing that. It's good. So, but I think it's, this is what Paige Patterson said. He said, "There appears to be no substantial reason to reject the nearly universal confidence of the church through the ages that the Revelation is the final preserved written scroll of John the Apostle." I agree with him. There have been, debates and disagreements, but I think John the Apostle wrote it. So, and that, from what I understood, you're agreeing, Trey, is that correct, that he wrote it?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else, question or comment about that? Okay. Now, when was it written? This is a very important question because evangelical writers, the majority of them would say it was written in AD 95 or 96. But there's a group of evangelical writers who say it was written about 60 to 65 BC. And there's a place there for you to fill in some blanks. The 60 to 65 BC would have to do with the persecution by Nero. All right, the emperor's name goes in the left on the little blank there, and the date goes on the right, and that would be 60 to 65. The AD, by the way, it's not everyone doesn't always do it, but when we talk about before Christ, BC follows the date. When we talk about after Christ, AD precedes the date. Now, I may not do it consistently, but that's the way it's supposed to be done. So the other date is AD 95, 96, and that was during the Emperor Domitian. There's good reasons to think this was written around AD 95. Nero, there was a huge fire in Rome, and Nero blamed the Christians for doing it. They didn't do it. It's not the first time a politician lied. All right. I know preachers lie too sometimes. Okay, but the persecution of the Christians took place in Rome. It did not take place throughout the entire empire. The one in 65, around AD 65. But the one in AD 95, Domitian was the emperor at the time. And he wanted you to refer to him as my Lord and God. And if you wouldn't do that, you were in trouble. And if you were a Christian, how could you do that? Refer to Domitian as my Lord and God. So there was intense persecution throughout the empire. And I think part of the reason this was written, God gave this revelation to John, was to encourage the Christians who were going through persecution. So I think the AD 95 fits better with that understanding. Now also, again, the early church fathers, they also, except for a rare exception, went along with AD 95 as the date. Now this makes a big difference, and here's the reason why. If you say that this was written in AD 65 or so, then what it's really predicting, according to some, is the fall of Jerusalem. Have you heard this view before? Yeah. And some would say all of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem. So Jesus even returning, they would say he was in, he appeared in the sky or something. I can't remember precisely. We're looking, kind of jumping ahead to interpretations here. I'm not buying into it, and I'll explain more later when we talk more about the interpretations, but I don't buy into this view. It's called the preterist view. And preterism means it's in the past. So according to the full preterist, the book of Revelation's been fulfilled. It was fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem. And again, we'll talk more about the interpretations later. This is a popular view, not real popular, but some people have really bought into it. And there's also what's called partial preterist. I think R.C. Sproul was one, but I'm not sure. And I think some of the partial preterists would say some of it was fulfilled, but not all of it was fulfilled. I have less problem with that type of approach than the full preterist who would argue it was all fulfilled. But again, we'll talk more about the interpretations later, but this is, if it was written in AD 95, obviously it cannot refer to the fall of Jerusalem because it's already taken place. So I think AD 95 is the better date there. Let's see how we're doing on time. It's 6 o'clock. So why don't we stop here? And if you have a question or comment, we'll,
Seemed like it'd be so much easier to just jump in it.
well,
No, I'm just saying, it just when you,
but you gotta answer these questions, somewhere.
but it just is, there's so many, and then once you get into what I'm saying, cause all of this is like, this viewpoint, that viewpoint, before you even get into it, then when you get into it, there's tons of different viewpoints. What does that mean, But,
And let me just say this before I forget it. If you have a prediction of the future, and I don't know, I'm kind of thinking something like this book raises your curiosity level. Yeah, it's tough to understand. It's tough to figure out. I'm not sure I have it all figured out. So it takes, but in other words, when we tell stories to our children, sometimes we use very imaginative, descriptive language to gather their interest or for other reasons. So in other words, I'm thinking there's a reason God has used this type of symbolic language. And I'll try to stop here. But I
so
think
you think about some of this stuff, and we're saying symbolic, and we say things, and we know part, lots of it is going to be, but what people can do, what can be done with the human body, or what people are doing with the human body, it makes you wonder how much of this that we think is symbolic, it might actually be literal.
Yeah.
It's weird stuff that they're doing with humans.
Yeah.
Making superhumans and doing weird stuff to people in different places and things. It's just
And
kind of
that's a good point. My kind of approach has been, okay, let's look at some of the other symbolic language in the Bible, looking like in the book of Daniel, the book of Ezekiel, and see what we understand about how that was fulfilled. And of course, conservative evangelical scholars can't agree on that either. But I think that's, in other words, like I talked about last week, trying to find, okay, what's the clear passages? And then when we start talking about the obscure, try to bring in some clarity from what we think is clear in the New Testament. I don't think Jesus has returned yet. I'm looking forward to it. The full preterist would say he's already returned. Some of them would say that. And we get into that another time, but okay, I'll stop here. Someone else have a comment or question?
There's some things in there that you can kind of, like when they try to open the seal, there's nobody that can open the seal. Everybody's sinful, now there's one that was sinless that can't open the scroll. That's understandable. But you also, whenever I look at it too, from this standpoint, I didn't live in John's day.
Yeah.
Probably the craziest thing, the most engineered thing John saw was a man on a chariot. So now, how do you describe for a man on a chariot a Air Force One airplane or a big old helicopter or whatever? How do you explain that? Do you explain the props as wings? I don't know. How would you actually explain it? He might have seen some things. He goes, well, I don't know what that is. I didn't see a human in there driving it. Because when you see a big chopper come over, you go, man, that sucker's big, and it's flying over, and you're not looking going, how many people are inside the thing, And when it starts shooting down, raining fire, it's hammering out bullets left and right, loud noises. So, I'm not saying that that's what's in Revelation. I'm just using that as an example because if you've never there's no way they could ever fathom it. Whoever got off the ground, they didn't have, you know, nobody jumped from cliffs with, even a parachute back then, I wouldn't imagine. So,
But it's amazing how biblically, like when you talk about crucifixion, when they predicted Christ's crucifixion, of what was gonna be done, how they described things that had never taken place before, and yet you were able to tell from that, knowing what had happened, to Jesus, you could quickly make a reference. They're talking about crucifixion. They're using those things to talk about crucifixion.
That's a great point.
So, you know, I don't know, God, I don't know, it's just, it's a scary world.
but if they would have never been captured by the Romans or under Roman power, they'd never been crucified, he'd never been crucified.
What?
Realistic. You said, talk about Jesus' crucifixion or whatever. The only people that crucified then was the Roman Empire, right?
But at the time that they wrote about it, when.
You mean like in this book of Psalms, is that what you're
Yes,
thinking about?
only some, yes, but when they were writing about that, even in other places, when, in the prophecy, they wrote about things that they had never seen, and they wrote about it pretty clear.
Yeah.
That in hindsight, you can look back and say, there's a reference to that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know, Trey, I think that there's some things that we think may be way over, that might be a more literal example than what it is.
You can tell them they can come in. Yeah, we're.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. If you see something different and you want to bring it up next time, that's fine. I'm open to. Again, I don't have it all figured out, and I'm glad we're going through the study. I want to understand it better. So.
This one actually ends today, go ahead and start. The next one is okay, to use the same guy.
Oh yeah, it's fine with me. In fact, the more he says I disagree with it, the more helpful I think it is to help us think through it.
You're right,
So,
okay.
I'm glad you recommended it.
But he's not, you don't believe what he is saying, yes. I mean, some of the things he's saying, he's talking about the churches, and he says that the churches actually existed during that time, doesn't he?
He even said that, yeah, he said that, and he also said that some people don't.
Avery, Blair,
Hey, by the way, each day, Monday, the 5th day, 6th.
Blair.
Yesterday, you talked about Annette and different